coordinate or to lead or develop strategies, etc., is the local authority. But what slightly worries me about, the response to COVID is that the dynamic between central and local government is not a particularly healthy one. You can see it in test and trace. You can see it in the way that different types of rules are being either imposed or negotiated with different local areas. If you think local solutions are important, you also need some local accountability. And the local accountability, for me at least, needs to involve local authorities and local government in some way, whether it be as developers of strategies, consulting local communities, providing help of a local sort to complement what's available nationally. But that also requires central government to let go of some of the powers it has, provide extra resources, all those things. And in the COVID version of this conversation, it's not necessarily going particularly well.
And maybe it's something, now we've highlighted it, maybe it's something that the climate agenda can pick up on. But thank you so much. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
No, it was great. It was really, really useful insights. And Jim, you don't know how beautifully you've just teed up our next interview right at the end there. So, Fraser, you were listening really intently and making some notes. What do you think of what Jim said?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway, as much as Jim maybe isn't overly optimistic, there's an important theme here of remembering that this involves the public writ large. It involves people's lives. It involves understanding their needs and how they have access to any potential changes, and making sure that we're taking people with us on this journey as well. So it's important to make sure that we're mindful at every stage, from policy design to implementation, if we're to take the opportunity that COVID may present now, to remember that there's a temptation to run quickly, but we also have to be mindful of taking people with us as well.
So heaps to digest there. You're listening to Local Zero with Matt Hannon, Rebecca Ford and Fraser Stewart. Thanks for being with us. Just a reminder that you can reach us on Twitter using the hashtag #LocalZero or by tweeting @EnergyRev_UK. Remember to send us any questions or thoughts that we might be able to address in upcoming episodes. But moving on, the second half of this episode is an interview with someone who's right at the sharp end of trying to make change happen on climate matters, and with real insight into how COVID has impacted that.
Hi, I'm Polly Billington. I'm the director of UK 100, and UK 100 is a network of UK leaders, local leaders from across local government and the UK who have made a commitment to 100% clean energy by 2050. And we're the only network in local government that is focused solely on climate, clean energy and clean air.
How do you think it's affected cities and communities, not just in the daily lives of the folk living there, but also in their net zero ambitions?
It's very easy if you can work from home and you've got enough room and you don't have caring responsibilities and you can afford to keep your house warm as it's getting colder, and you've got a garden and you're within walking distance of somewhere where you can have exercise. A lot of middle class people are actually quite enjoying this. A lot of other people are having a really, really, really hard time. And the great danger is that environmentalists wang on, not to use too fine a point, about how we get these benefits and stop thinking about the other things that people really miss. People really miss social interaction. They really miss meeting people other than the people that they live with. A lot of people are in real economic difficulties, and being able to afford to keep a roof over your head and to keep your family fed are bigger pressures now than they ever have been. The idea now of starting to talk to people about paying a little bit more for food that is more sustainably sourced and so forth, these things are a long way away from people's priorities. So focus on how we can work with what people actually need. What they actually need now is jobs, security, comfortable, safe, secure homes, and an environment in which they feel their children and the people that they love are safe and healthy. And that is the way you win a climate argument.
When all is said and done on this, do you think COVID is just going to have proven a distraction to local authorities?
Well, we're trying to make sure that
do you think it could end up reinforcing the climate agenda? I mean, I'm looking back, say, we're in 2025. Was it just a footnote? I'm talking in the context of climate action or not?
Where people have already integrated it in, you will see climate-friendly actions being used to meet COVID challenges. And like the low traffic neighbourhoods are a really good example. You've seen some local authorities try them and drop them within a fortnight because they've seen it as too difficult.
Wandsworth would be an example.
And others are absolutely hanging tough on it and saying, yeah, it takes a bit of time, you've got to settle in, but it'll be worth it in the end. To be honest, walking and cycling is the easy bit, particularly for places in London. The idea that walking and cycling is the way to tackle connectivity with work in the valleys of Wales, in Derbyshire, right, in small car heavy towns like places like Peterborough, is for the birds. So the biggest challenge, and this is what people aren't talking about, is how you have a COVID-proof recovery for public transport. We have to get public transport right. If we don't have public transport in our communities, in the rural communities, we will not be able to meet our net zero targets that we've already said to ourselves we should do. We're going to continue to have congestion. We're going to continue to have bad safety records for children and so forth. And we're going to continue to have unhealthy communities. So when people see the connections between climate and their other objectives, you're in a much better place. I'll give you one example. Dr. Maria Neira is the climate change lead in the World Health Organization. She's brilliant because she says you could actually look at all the climate actions that need to be taken in order to be able to meet the Paris Agreement and measure them for their health impacts. And suddenly you will have a different conversation with politicians. Politicians you normally wouldn't get a meeting with will suddenly say, what do you mean our children will live longer? What do you mean we're going to be able to tackle diabetes and obesity if we do this? What do you mean we're going to be able to increase the life expectancy of people in places that have been highly deprived because they're going to have less bad mental health outcomes because they're going to have work, right? Then you get people get really interested. And where people have had enough time to think about it before this hit, they have been able to see where those things are aligned. And they can see where sometimes they aren't. We know that, for example, lockdown is finished and people are frightened to go back on the bus because they're worried about public transport being somewhere where you're more likely to catch it. So people have returned to their cars, which is terrible, right? However, using emergency transport powers, local authorities have been really bold in creating low traffic neighbourhoods. Now, that ain't easy. Let me tell you, as an elected councillor where we've got a low traffic neighbourhood, you get a lot of fury from people who are saying, well, hang on a minute, I can't drive to my local supermarket and I used to be able to, and why do I have to take quite as long? Those things settle down, so we need to acknowledge that those things will change over time. But if you think about the economy having tanked, resources having shriveled, they've got massive public health responsibilities, their own staff are at risk, staying at home, mourning people who they've lost themselves or looking after people who are ill. Basic delivery of services are adversely affected. You're not going in to mend your own council houses who need repairing because there's a risk of contagion. And the impact on education, the next generation. So they're thinking about all of that. And then if any of us come along and go, oh, by the way, would you like to knock out some megatons of CO2 from your economy? You'd be unsurprised if you get a bit of short shrift.
For local authorities to get the power, to get the resources to take the action that you're referring to, I guess key decisions have to be made by central government. Do you think central government is willing to make that call?
Well, I think there's something that has come out of COVID. And admittedly, I'm always going to see this in sort of the political dimension because that's how I work, right? I'm sure other people will be able to see, the technological advances or backwards stuff. But what I've seen is a big tension between national government and local government in England, right? That's been going on in Scotland for some time. It's now come to a head in England where there's been devolution created with directly elected mayors in some of our biggest cities are now saying, no, you can't do it like that. Even though we've got to a point now, probably better than we've ever had done, on a consensus between national and local government that there is something that needs to be done and they both need to do something about it.
So for me, I guess the follow-up to that is, do you see that the necessary power and money being devolved down to the regional level first and then trickling down to a local level where you can see this kind of grassroots bottom-up action? I think your point there about the analogies between the north of England, for example, and Scotland and this push for this power to make local and regional decisions feels like there's a template potentially for other regions in the UK to follow.
Yeah, but it's not working right now, is it? So we're trying to establish a kind of a kind of parallel conversation, which is slightly more polite, maybe a little bit more diplomatic, maybe a bit more long-term, establishing some kind of political consensus where we go, right, brilliant. You've legislated for net zero by 2050. That's fantastic. Legislation, as we know from other previous legislative targets, like ending child poverty and so forth, are only as good as the frameworks and policies you put in place to make them true. So legislating for net zero sends a very strong signal that that's what you want to happen, but it's not enough on its own. You need to be able to send some other signals. We know as local leaders, we want to do this. We also know you can't do it without us. We may well be the transport authority in our local community. We're certainly the planning authority in our local community to a greater or lesser extent. We are the ones who decide things like building standards where we are up to a point, and that's where I'll get to. We also make decisions about the services that the services we deliver and the services we procure. We're the ones who make decisions about what kind of fleet we have, how we run our buildings. And we've got a larger kind of bully pulpit, is what the language is in political science, bully pulpit about what we can do with the wider community, both our residents and businesses. So in that circumstance, if the government can't do it without us, the government needs to understand what we can do and make sure that either we have to do other things or that they enable us to do it. Because every time local authorities try to do things that are net zero, they bump up against national regulation which gets in the way. So, for example, on community energy, there might be limitations on what the Ofgem will let happen. Highways England drives massive, great big urban motorways through a significant number of local areas. And if you're trying to tackle decarbonisation or air quality, Highways England doesn't have an obligation to deal with that. So therefore, you can't actually deal with the biggest problem. However good your stuff can be, and it is extraordinary what some local authorities are managing to achieve in these circumstances, quite often there'll be particular combination of circumstances which will make their position unique. Nottingham, for example, is one of the very few local authorities that owns its own bus company, so has therefore been able to do more on public transport than many other places. Cornwall managed to secure a devolution deal, like Matt was saying, where they managed to get the power to cap public transport fares, and therefore they've actually seen an increase in the number of people using public transport in Cornwall, one of the most rural places in the country. So when other county councils will say, oh no, we can't possibly do public transport here, and actually say, well, actually, think about it creatively. There are other ways of increasing uptake on public transport by asking for those powers if you are in the conversation with government about devolution deals.
So are we looking at very context-specific solutions for different regions, or is there a broader vision that you can see lots of local authorities being brought into what they'd like to see for the future and how they would like to drive this change forward at local levels?
If we keep talking about everything being bespoke, it's suggesting that everybody is entitled to a Christian Dior gown, right? Now, I might like a Christian Dior gown of my own, but it's not a practical way of saying everyone can have one. Okay, what we can do is make sure there are some standard ways of going about it. And it's a matrix. You know, everybody likes to think that they're unique, but the uniqueness is a combination of particular circumstances.
So that was what I was going to add there, Polly. I mean, I think that's part of the attraction, isn't it? Part of the sale pitch is that it can be bespoke, but what you're saying is if you treat everything bespoke, nothing will ever get done. You can't scale up. You can't learn from your neighbours.
Exactly. Blackpool and Eastbourne and Brighton have more in common with each other as seaside towns than they possibly have with places very close by. But they will also have some shared interest because they've got geographical proximity to places right by them, which have got different political environments and so forth. Then you suddenly realise that what is their energy resource? What are their social needs? What are their economic needs? What are their ambitions in terms of what they want to be able to design for their town? The biggest lesson I would say for anybody working in energy and climate who hasn't really thought about their local council, apart from the fact they pay their council tax and whether they empty their bins, is they have a set of immediate pressing priorities, even without COVID, that they have to deliver. They have to deliver adult social services. They have to deliver care for young people. They have to empty your bins. They have to keep the lights on, those kind of things. Now, if you've got climate-friendly solutions to those challenges, you're more likely to get traction inside local government rather than if you come along and say, hello, I'd really like your help in saving the polar bear. Because polar bear is not in their list of priorities.
And so one thing I'm really hearing from you, Polly, is that local authorities have a central role to play, but certainly they're overburdened and need